change resilience. But when thinking about it, can these two framings coexist? Or does it stand to be a simplistic rhetoric and therefore not a representation of the complex ground realities, uncertainties, and deeply intersectional inequalities that make women societal in a very unequal group? Balancing between those two dynamics creates a complicated landscape, opening up a space on where we can debate on these commonly assumed policy rhetorics. To discuss this further, this session invites insights from the Global Water Partnership, Central Africa, where we'll hear from Muriel Noel Lugazova, the Program Officer of Water, Climate Development and Gender Program at the Central African branch of GWP, and Simplish Tinda, the Director of the Department of Meteorology and Permanent Resident of WMO in Cameroon, to speak on strengthening women's resilience to climate change in Cameroon. Then we'll travel to Bihar, India, to hear from Deepa Joshi, IMI and WLE's Gender, Youth and Inclusion Lead, on the intersectional inequalities that women and men still face in the midst of implementing climate change adaptation strategies. We will then dive into a short panel session with a focus on brainstorming a solution framework into overcoming the discrimination that women may face when affected by climate change risks. Coming from rich backgrounds, we will hear from Liza Debevec, the Senior Gender, Water and Social Inclusion Specialist at GWP, then Alan Nickel, IMI's Strategic Program Director of Water Growth and Inclusion, and last but definitely not least, Aditi Mukherjee, IMI's Principal Researcher of Climate Change Adaptation, Groundwater Institution and Policies, and Community Management of Water Resources. Before we encapsulate ourselves into developing our train of thought, I would like to share a trailer of an award-winning documentary, The Ant and the Grasshopper, that illustrates how power and privilege shape climate justice and food justice, stretching from Africa to America, and how such polar opposites can come together, unite, and be inclusive of each other in order to move forward. 1 second, please.
Nina shawanangwa ichi nguva sambizga vanyane nikupangire po movili munhu wakuti wako ufire ngeko mwana kazi dangu lake ni isitira ufiri va ivi malo ya mawilo ya vula ningo inyage pachaka iko waka 3 ndikuti chili chose chayomira SFHC akatiphalira kuti ni climate change chifukwa cha ukhaliro wa vanyitu wakuwalo nge wa America. Padango lithu palati kukhumba kuti vinthu visinthe tikumuyendera munthu kuchikaya kwake na kukadumbisana naye. Nkagomezga yayi nkhala ngenkhulota.
God said you can increase like sand, but he never said spoil the atmosphere.
I don't see it as an issue. That's my problem.
How are you seeing the climate affecting your family?
We see it more as a political agenda.
It would take a global catastrophe to do a complete 180.
Nkhani ya unenesko ikuchedwa kwenda. Kwenye ya utesi kushitavichi kwenda ruiru. Kwenye ise chigomezo utili nacho. Bali nyerere zinandi. Kwenye nyerere tuchoko tukunyamula panana.
What strikes me from this brief glimpse of the documentary is how those who are at the very center of the climate crisis, battling drought to food scarcity, have to take the extra step to convince the rest of the world that climate change is real in order to attract the help and support they rightly deserve. Stories like this exposes that most of our world's population are not only having to battle against the ever-increasing climate risks, but also the social cultural challenges such as race, class, and in most cases, patriarchal systems in order to achieve some kind of social justice. As the urgency around climate change grows, so does the divide between the global north and the global south, making us switch the narratives from leaving no one behind to it's all men and women for themselves. Recognizing this disconnect urges us to question the current systems in place. Is what we're doing enough? Is the attention we're giving to climate change and gender covering a broad spectrum or a more narrow lens of issues? The fact of the day is, this session is the only gender-focused session within the Water Pavilion event space. While such innovative talks have been held over the past week, ranging from resilient water schemes, nature-based solutions, water management, water stewardship, no one has really acknowledged or addressed women's rights, representation, and resources within this climate change arena, which is quite funny and concerning at the same time, because women represent half of the world's population. And without providing a space to socially include them, I don't see how any of the mentioned projects will ever succeed. Given this context and what you should be hearing from the speakers, we would love to hear what you think in relation to the interactions between gender and climate change. How can we harness gender equality to achieve greater climate resilience across the water, food, climate nexus? So please drop in your thoughts and comments by clicking on the link and typing in the code displayed on the screen. These instructions are also available in your chat, so please take a minute to provide some input. To start off in uncovering the complexity behind this rhetoric, I would like to introduce GWP to take the stage to reflect on their insights of the intersectional challenges that women face in Cameroon. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Upandha. I share my screen. Thank you, Upandha. Now I will share the experience of Cameroon in strength. On how to adapt the resilience to climate change in the far north region of Cameroon. Our content is based on the role of the Global Water Partnership to secure water resources and what are we living on daily basis, what are the problems identified in agricultural sector, and the strengthening women resilience as the solution we have adopted in GWP. What are the difficulties and challenges we are facing during this pilot initiative, some recommendation and some key messages to keep in mind. So we have the Global Water Partnership Central Africa, and we are, apart from Global Water Partnership World, with a network of multi-stakeholder government, university, and civil society. And we are promoting the integrated resources water management. And nowadays, we have observed that the water cycle is affected by climate change, which leads to climate hazard, namely some lower sea levels, drought, floods. So we can say that water is climate because the scarcity or availability of water depends on the variation of climate. So what is the strategy of the GWP for 2020 to 2025 is to secure the world through the dialogue, where you have to mobilize every stakeholders of the water and climate sectors. You have to mobilize funds, you have to mobilize partners, technical and financial. And also we have to act by implementing projects, influence strategies, and also we have to learn. So this present communication is more about sharing experience on the adaptation on climate change in far north region. So our reality here in Cameroon is that we have 5 agroecological zones in Cameroon, and the most vulnerable one is the far north region of Cameroon. And in this context, the environmental and the environmental context is so harsh at the socioeconomic level, more for women than the other communities. So this agroecological zone is vulnerable to climate change in several points. We have some floods when there is heavy rains, which destroy crops and livestock, and also affecting agriculture, which is the main source of livelihood for the population. We can also note that there is very low annual rainfall. For example, in 2021, we have only 4 months for rain, and the heavy rainfall only in mid of September. Also, we have to notice that there is a lack of water for domestic and uses and economic use, also a poor quality of of water resources. And this can lead to conflicts between stakeholders like fishermen or farmers in Logan. We also notice that the reality is that the women are undereducated because of the patriarchal system. We give more chances to young boys and men to go far in study than women. So you can see on figure 3 how women are the principal actors in collecting waters. From the smallest girl to the elderly women, all are the core of collecting water. For scarcity, you can see, and scarcity and poor quality of water, you can see at your right, the pictures of young girls and young boys are collecting water, which is not very clear for using. So in this region of the far north in Cameroon, women are vulnerable from climate change on several points. We can notice that women are at the center of several economic activities in the area, particularly agriculture, but they are left behind. Rural women produce about 19% of the food stock, and they spend 6 to 8 hours a day on farm work by planting and harvesting. And also their physical appearance suffers damage due to the practice of rudimentary agriculture on large tracts and with often low yield. This vulnerability is also perceived in agriculture, where the women are not really equipped to adapt on the seasonal variation and the impact of insects, which greatly affects production. Some testimony of a farmer in Mary of Far North said that we plot the fields, we plant, we wait, but the rains do not come. Last year, we had to replant the maize because it didn't rain when we expected it to. So this point, this situation leads to food insecurity, where about 33% of the population in far north region of Cameroon suffer from food insecurity, and 38% are living below the poverty line. We can also notice that this area is very insecure because of Boko Haram attacks. Then the main gender issues in this agricultural sector is that women who are the main producer but do not get to decide, and they are rarely have access to agrometeorological information because this information has a very high technical language and they cannot use it because of their undereducation. We can also notice that the patriarchal society limits female ownership rights to natural resources, in this case, farmland. So briefly, the four factors of the vulnerability of women in agriculture are based on the gender climate change framework of CGIAR, the ethnic group of affiliation, the age group, also the high socioeconomic context, the far north region with a harsh biophysic environment vulnerable to climate change, and also the patriarchal systems who discriminates women, and also plans, policy strategies which are not gender transformative. So based on this situation, we can face some issue in agricultural sector in far north region Cameroon, namely the decrease in agricultural production due to climate change. The subsistence crops are not resistant to climate variation, and farmers do not have enough knowledge to explore the cultivation of new crops that adapt well to climate variation. There is also increase of hunger, poverty, and a wider food insecurity gap. Then how does GWP engage in reducing these issues? So through the implementing of the Water Climate Development Gender Program in Cameroon, we have first of all organized a multi-stakeholder workshop to identify mechanisms to collect and share agrometeorological information to ensure its effective use at the local level. This was a platform where women from NGO and who are specialized in agriculture can express themselves on their issues and problem they have faced during their agricultural activities. So a main result of this first action was that the Penyamundi community radio station started a weather forecast program in the Douala local language. Another point as a solution for GWP was to organize a global action with the Ministry of Transport, GWP, CAF, and WMO, with the participation of the local government, churches, leaders, farmers, and community radio to training farmers in Mary subdivision in Far North on weather, climate, and agriculture. We have about 5 women trained, and among 35 participants took part in this seminar. This was a very big challenge to involve women because of sociocultural barriers. And how do we capitalize? How do we go beyond these sociocultural barriers? We capitalize the influence of women leaders in the community and their relation with the church, the traditional chiefdom, and mayor. So our approach to adapt in climate, the agricultural in the context of climate change is to apply the gender transformative approach that we have already started at the relation level, because women representative of common initiative groups on agriculture had the opportunity during our multi-stakeholder dialogue to present their agricultural inputs, their needs in the agricultural sectors. At the individual level, we improve the women's capacity through the reinforcing of their knowledge on weather, climate, and agriculture. And also, we have trained them on the use of rain gauges to help them collect in situ information on the amount of rainfall to improve planning for the planting season. A key result for this is that a female leader has been designated as a focal point of a rain gauge station to collect data on the field on daily basis and share to regional services of transport in charge to treat it. So based on the sociocultural context, which is not easy, and the socioeconomic context, we have faced some difficulties on involving more women in these activities because this was a challenge because of the cultural system placing them as the main occupant of the household. So they are always busy with cars, and to them, this is their first duty. Also, internet coverage isn't the best in this area, neither in the telephone network coverage, making the transmission of in situ climate data collected by focal points very difficult. We also notice as a difficulty the low literacy level of the women, especially in information technology, which limits the possibility of adopting climate information dissemination methods that will involve ICT knowledge. So what we can recommend to the stakeholders is that we have to influence strategies, plans, laws, and related to agriculture so that they can be gender transformative. We have to develop a common vision between stakeholders for gender transformative agriculture. We also need to promote the training of women from organizations and associations specialized in agriculture in the area. We also need to conduct some studies to measure the vulnerability to climate change of women and men farmers in the Far North region. And then identify and promote local action developed by communities for a resilient agriculture. We also have to promote training of couple, husband and wife for the next pilot initiative to raise or to go against every social barriers. Also a need is to mobilize funds to promote the gender transformative agriculture within the context of climate change. What we have to keep in mind is that common vision for gender transformative agriculture will give easy access to climate information for women and take part in their participation in agriculture planning process. It's also important to keep in mind that we have for a gender transformative law policies and plans in agriculture. Also for social barriers or to improve the participation of women, wives can accompany their husband to trainings on climate agriculture to remove sociocultural gender barriers. And finally, we can say that a good harvest in the Far North region of Cameroon will reduce hunger and poverty. So thank you for your kind attention. I will give the floor to the director of the Department of Meteorology and the permanent resident of the WMO in Cameroon for a word. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor. The National Meteorological Department is the public institution in charge of data collection, production, and dissemination of meteorological forecasts and climate information in Cameroon. One of our main objectives is to get our information to the end users, who is not always found in the urban centers or often difficult to reach through new media. Our information is developed in French and English, which are the languages that are not always used in the rural area. We must therefore not only produce information, quality information, but also ensure that our information reaches all recipients and that they understand it and use it in decision making, especially related to agriculture. As we all know, the current context in our country is marked by strong climatic variation, which leads to extreme weather events. In this context, meteorological and climatic information is more than ever necessary to strengthen resilience and promote better adaptation of population, especially vulnerable groups, notably women. Thanks to the collaboration with GWP Central Africa, we were able to train community radio animators on the dissemination of our information in local languages, better understood by their different community. We have also trained the leaders of women's association living in rural area so that they can serve as a relays in the chain of dissemination of information. More recently, with the support of the World Meteorological Organization, we organized in collaboration with GWP Central Africa a roving seminar in Miri, a locality in the far north region of Cameroon. The initiative of roving seminar for the popularization of climate information allow us to present and explain our forecast to rural population and to train them to make better use of our information in their agricultural activities. We also seize the opportunity to train them on how to collect rainfall data using rain gauge, and we proceed to set up a small pilot network for collecting rainfall data, which is a complementary to our data collection network.
Sorry, sir, I don't interrupt you, but I'm so sorry, sir. I don't mean to interrupt you, but unfortunately, we are very short on time and we have to move forward. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me for interrupting you.
Hello.
We are very short on time, unfortunately, so we have to move forward. We'll definitely get back to you, and then if there's any more insight, we'll definitely contact you. Please, I deeply apologize. So thank you so much, Muriel and Sophie. I mean, the key message that we grasp from you is that presentation is that the influence of patriarchal norms and equities really over combines everything, and it really impacts the way women are ability to respond and cope with climate change impacts. So maybe Deepa will be able to cover these tangled issues within her focus on Bihar. But to start off the presentation, we shall watch a documentary prepared to go alongside her presentation. So let's just do that.
Ça plutôt le temps. Ça c'est que tu visites ça.
बिहार के कई क्षेत्र जलवायु परिवर्तन के कारण अलग अलग प्रकार की समस्याओं से जूझ रहे हैं। एक तरफ जहां दक्षिणी बिहार खारे पानी और सूखे की समस्या से जूझ रहे हैं, वहीं उत्तरी बिहार बाढ़ से ग्रस्त है। हवा पानी के इस बदलाव से यहाँ के किसान बहुत पीड़ित हैं। मैं भी किसानों के परिवार से हूँ। वैसे तो अपना गांव छोड़े हुए काफी समय बीत गए, पर आज भी जब इन किसानों को देखती हूँ तो 2004 के बाढ़ का दृश्य मेरी आंखों के सामने आ जाता है। 2004 की बाढ़ के दौरान मैं गर्भवती थी। पड़ोस में रहने वाली एक महिला के घर में पानी घुसने के कारण छत में ही उसे बच्चे को जन्म देना पड़ा। ये सुनकर मैं घबरा गई।
एक के फसल हुई है, दोबारा फसल में दहा जाए नहीं हुई है। माल जाले तो सब दिन नहीं करबे तो फिर केना होते।
और घरों में पानी फिसल रहा है।
हाँ, घर में वही माल वाला है।
फिर माल जाल के कहाँ रख ले रही है?
पानी में, और निकास बारी की दिक्कत हो तो पानी में जाए चली हिल के।
तो काम अगर यहाँ करे चाहिए खेती में, तो वो अगर बेचली उचली तो पैसा के रखे है?
पैसा महाजन के कर ली, महाजन के दे दिली, अपना जे खाइला रखबे से रखबे।
तो पैसा के हिसाब बाड़ी के रखे यहाँ या
घर वाला दूल्हा रखे।
लेकिन काम तो यहाँ करे छिए?
काम करे छिए हम।
उस टाइम रेट था जोत की जमीन का 40,000 रुपये कट, हम बेचे 19,000 रुपये कट। खरीदार नहीं है, कोई लेने को तैयार नहीं है। लड़की की शादी कर रहे थे, अच्छा रिश्ता मिला हुआ था, तो अगर नहीं टाइम पर पैसा देते तो हो सकता है वो छोड़ दे। मजबूरी हम उसको बेच दिए। गेहूँ की तो अभी भी आप गए होंगे तो देखा होगा, फसल है, लेकिन वो घर आ जाए तब ना। पीछे से आधे आदमी का भीग गया, बारिश में डूब गया, उसी में पेड़ जम गया, बाली में पेड़ आ गए।
खेती के अलावा और क्या करते हैं?
वही मजदूरी कर लेते हैं, मकान उकान बनता है उसमें काम कर लेते हैं। बाढ़ आने के समय में और जाने के समय में लमसम 4-5 महीना वैसे रह जाता है, कोई चीज़ मिलता नहीं है। पानी कमेगा तभी तो घर बना पाएगा, सही से नहीं पाता है, पन्नी जुगी बना के रहता है उसमें।
कभी सोचा नहीं कि जहाँ पे आपका घर है उसको छोड़ के कहीं दूसरी जगह घर बनाए या गांव को छोड़ के चले जाएं?
गांव छोड़ने का तो इच्छा नहीं करता है, क्योंकि महंगाई बढ़ गया। शहर में काफ़ी महंगे में मिल रहे हैं, उतने पास मजदूर के पास पैसे नहीं हो पाता है। शायद संजोग कोई मजदूर उठ के ले लेता है, तो दिक्कत है। किसान वर्ग का, निचले स्तर का लोग के लिए बहुत दिक्कत है शहर में जाना।
यहाँ से तो खैर तटिए टूट के हट गए, निशान यह है। यहाँ से पानी रहल, तहाँ से मट्टी झड़ झड़ के तहाँ से ई टट्टी बदला गए। ये कल के एते पर पानी चल के मुँह डूबल है।
दलित समुदाय की किसान जानकी देवी के सर पर घर चलाने की पूरी जिम्मेदारी है। उनके पति प्रवासी मजदूर हैं जो कभी कभी ही पैसे भेज पाते हैं। इसीलिए ऐसी नीतियों की सख्त जरूरत है जो जलवायु परिवर्तन के कारण हो रही समस्याओं का समाधान कर सके। IWMI स्कीम का फायदा भटगामा गांव के कई पिछड़े वर्ग के किसानों को हुआ था। जानकी देवी उनमें से एक थी।
अयलक एक बार 3500 रुपया।
तो पैसा कहाँ खर्चा के लिए?
खेती के पैसा खेतिए में कैली, खेती पथारी अपने कैली। धान के सीजन में धान में लग खर्चा कैली, आखिर हो तो बाद में खर्चा कैली। न है हाथ पर तो कर्जो महाजन लेके कैली, अगर आ गल तो वह पैसा दो देली सूद ब्याज वाला के, एना कह के कैली।
खेती ठीक से न हो पाने के कारण किसान अक्सर कर्ज के चक्रव्यूह में फंस जाते हैं। सरकार और प्राइवेट कंपनियों ने मिलकर बिहार के हालात को सुधारने के लिए कई नीतियों की शुरुआत की है। बिहार में बाढ़ के अलावा सूखा भी एक बहुत बड़ी समस्या है। इसी को मद्देनजर रखते हुए सरकार ने जल जीवन हरियाली जैसी योजनाओं की शुरुआत करी है। ये भी देखा गया है कि नीतियां जिनसे किसानों को किसी प्रकार का आर्थिक लाभ हो, उन नीतियों की जानकारी किसानों तक पहुंच ही नहीं पाती, खासकर पिछड़े वर्ग के किसानों को।
आइबो करे जी घीचे ना तो अही पर से फिरा जी चौर में कहाँ से चौर में देखते त घर घर फिरा दे लोग से फिरा दे यही मोरे पर से कि नई पानी जाके देखती तब ना
कौन लोग फिरावे है?
गांव के लोग फिरा दे।
बागमती में बांध निर्माण, तटबंध का निर्माण कराया जा रहा है दोनों तरफ, तो गांव को विस्थापित करके बांध के उस तरफ ले जाना है और उस तरफ हम लोग जाके बसेंगे, बशर्ते कि गवर्नमेंट मुआवजा दे दी।
घर में भी पानी घुसता है आपके?
नहीं, घर में नहीं घुसता है, गांव सुरक्षित है। थोड़ा सा पार्ट उधर है उसमें जाता है और थोड़ा सा पार्ट इधर है उसमें आता है, बाकी गांव सुरक्षित। हम लोग बैंक के ऋणी हैं केसीसी से, और केसीसी के अगेंस्ट में बैंक अपने आप प्रीमियम हमसे लेके इंश्योरेंस कर देता था। उसके एवज में लमसम अमाउंट हम लोगों को मिल जाता था, जो क्षति होता था वो मिलता था। लेकिन तब बिहार सरकार उसको बंद करके फसल सहायता योजना लागू कर दिया। ऊंट के मुंह में जीरा का फोरन भी है, वो भी बिचौलिया के माथे पर चला जाता है।
किसान सलाहकार अब बटाईदारी करता है। वो बटाईदारी क्या करता है, तो क्षेत्र में आया, घूम के अपना एजेंट के माध्यम से आदमी को ठीक किया कि तुमको भाई 20,000 रुपया इनपुट में आएगा,
10,000 हमको दे देना, 10,000 तुम रख लेना। जो खेती नहीं करता है वो बहुत खुश कि हमको तो मुफ्त में 10,000 आ रहा है, चलो करा दो। उसका अधिक पैसा आता है, जो जेन्युइन किसान है उसको कम पैसा आता है। ये स्थिति है। एक ही चीज का बेनिफिट हम लोग को समय मिल रहा है, किसान सम्मान निधि जो है उसका 2000 रुपया पर चौथे महीने हम लोग को समय मिल रहा है।
What PMAPY does is it relies on the yield indices. Yield indices in the sense crop yields. Okay, so it relies on the production data of the crop. You need to actually go on ground. You need to cut crop, take an average, and then understand what could be the yield, average yield for, let's say, paddy crop. While doing that, a lot of time gets elapsed. This whole process is very manual. That's one part. Second is the cash crunch that is very often seen on the state's side. Most of these products, including IBFI, including PMAPY, these are highly subsidized products. And if the subsidies don't come in on time, then obviously, unless you have all the premiums received, you will not get the claims from the insurance companies. I believe we have fantastic products on ground, which are fairly democratically structured. However, implementation-wise, we can be better. We can reduce the time gaps which come in because of the manual nature of the crop cutting experiments, at times because of the delays of the subsidy.
Basically, current climate change policies are mainly focused on disaster relief program that are easy to do and politically also very attractive. But this could work for small disasters. But if you have disasters very frequent and catastrophic events, it will cost huge amount of money to the government and it will be unbearable to cover entire population. So here we need the risk transfer tools like insurance, where the cost and the burden is borne by the third party.
इतने सालों बाद मैं बिहार वापस आई, इन किसानों से मिली, एक फिल्म मेकर के तौर पे बातें की, लेकिन दिल में कहीं ना कहीं खुद की भावनाएं भी उमड़ रही थीं। आकस्मिक छाए बादलों के बीच आज सरकारी योजना हो या IBFI जैसी स्कीम एक आशा की किरण मालूम होती है, पर यहाँ भी अभी कुछ और सुधार की गुंजाइश है। जैसे कुछ किसानों की ना तो योजनाओं तक पहुंच है, न जानकारी, खासकर पिछड़े वर्ग के किसानों को, पर उम्मीद है इस तरह की योजनाएं हर किसान के चेहरे की मुस्कान का कारण जरूर बनेंगे।
Deepa, would you like to give us a brief 1 minute, 2 minute overview of anything?
Yes, thanks very much, Upandha. So I'm not going to go to my presentation in the interest of time because we have a really interesting panel and it would be good to hear from them. So the point that I want to make here is that, vulnerability is a word that we are considerably, so please don't change my slides, Upandha. I am not going to be speaking to all the slides. Thanks a lot. So vulnerability is something that we are hearing a lot in the new climate discourse, including in the IPCC report. And what we are also understanding is that vulnerability is caused by multiple overlapping factors, which are social, political, economic, geographic, etc. So the question that I want to pose is, how well are we understanding vulnerability of the most marginalized when we are developing and designing tools, technologies, and approaches to address water, food challenges as a result of climate impacts? And especially in relation to water, I think it's very important to remember that a lot of the climate work that happens is focused on agriculture and irrigation, drought, flood control, interventions. But I think when you look at water, and what the video showed is that, the water impacts of climate, shape women's vulnerabilities both at home in relation to domestic water supply, as well as outside of the home in the fields. And often, we don't have comprehensive programs that look into these fluid dynamics of water within, various aspects of everyday experiences of vulnerability. And the video had a word called emotions, in the last, very last minute of the video. And I think it's important to remember that the impacts of climate-related stresses on water, which are experienced at home, in the fields, have also other dimensions other than the material losses. So there's been very interesting work done by Northwestern University, which shows that a lot of the water-related experiences that have a gender implication are around sleep, around shame, are around worry. So these are issues that we don't seem to deal with very well in the design of how we should be addressing climate vulnerabilities, water-related climate vulnerabilities. So really my what I want to emphasize is that this video was really a zoom in of climate vulnerabilities, and this zoom in and zoom out is what is really required, and bridging the gap between the zoomed out climate data and the zoomed in vulnerabilities that we see of the most marginalized. And that is the message that I want to leave you all with. Over to you, Upandha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepa. So just in interest of time, as Deepa mentioned, we'll go straight to the panel sessions, starting with Liza. Right. Liza, at GWP, you were the first full-time person assigned to be dedicated to gender. And in your role, you've started to map out the gender needs and issues in the GWP network and the wide water sector. So given that, do you believe country-level policies have done enough to address the gender dimensions of climate change? And if not, what are your recommendations to build a more inclusive space? Over to you, Liza.
Thank you very much, Upandha. Sorry, my voice is breaking out a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes, so with GWP, we're working closely with countries to support them in the process of improving their policies for better water governance. And that, of course, includes issues of gender equality and social inclusion. And while most countries around the globe have, really improved in including gender equality and social inclusion issues in their policies, in the legislation, it is the implementation that often lags behind. And, there are many obstacles to that. But if we think about enabling factors for this kind of work, it's that political will that is the first and foremost important enabling factor. And as countries and their leaders are becoming more and more aware of these issues, of course, the political will is growing. So that's a great thing. But then, of course, we need the funds and we need the capacity in terms of human resources, people in these positions who can then implement the kind of work we need to do. So having gender experts in organizations, in government institutions who are there to keep an eye on these issues, because not everybody has the capacity and training to do this kind of work. So that's really important to have the experts in the room who can address these issues. And the experts that are aware of the kind of intersectionalities and the vulnerabilities that Deepa was talking about, and also the social norms that prevent women and other vulnerable populations from participating or from benefiting from the interventions in the space of climate resilience building, like Muriel was talking about in the case of Cameroon, where just access to the information is really missing. So I believe that we all can do more in this space and really holding one another accountable. So us as institutions working in this field, holding both governments and donors accountable in that space, but also then internally within our organizations practicing these things so that we can lead by example would be another important thing. So, donors really putting more stress on this when they talk about doing gender inclusive work, making sure that the budgets that they're providing allow for this kind of work to be done, because that is still the least funded component of climate resilience work. So I'd really say putting money where their mouth is, or, and also then, to speak in cliches, to really walk the talk in this area. But I think a lot of it, a lot has been achieved. And so the building blocks are there. And I think that it's a good space that we can build on. So I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liza. Moving on to Alan, we run from a country level perspective from Liza to a more global viewpoint. Through your line of work, you must have recognized that while the costs of climate risks are unevenly distributed across society, we can look at the root cause of such varied impacts to be maybe power, poverty, and inequality rather than physical scarcity, right? So having that as a basis, what structural issues do we need to be aware about when trying to influence the global processes such as COP and to effectively integrate gender equality dimensions into COP26 and beyond? Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Upandha. This is a huge set of questions embedded in one question. I think, the UNFCCC has certainly been paying attention to these issues. I would say, at least as far back as I remember, COP15, 2009, and probably much earlier. But part of the challenge is the progress has been very slow. And I think that reflects these political will issues and some of the embedded power structures and power imbalances out there. It's difficult, it takes time, progress is slow. But we need to focus on these structures of power. We can't just rely on, say, counting numbers of women participating as our measure of success. We've got to think beyond that. We've really got to think about how, for instance, at country levels, can we bring into delegations and into the voices that speak about climate and the climate emergency a better balance between views, and not just the gender balance, but also other intersectionalities. Those who have who are more marginalized and more vulnerable, they need to be able to speak out too. And I think that came out in that film, some of these incredibly precarious livelihood situations that many people live in, and the nature of gender and gender inequality within those situations. So I think the first point is the structural power imbalances. We've got to look beyond headcount and participation and start looking at the structures of power, the transformative issues that I heard our colleagues in Cameroon mention. And let's face it, there's still only a third of women participants in the country delegations to most of the COP events and bodies. So there's a lot that can be done to still build a better balance there. And one of the issues that's coming through in the analysis the UNFCCC is doing is that, those who speak at events, 75% are men, right? And 25% are women. So there's a huge imbalance there in terms of the voice that's actually getting into these important key international processes. So we've got to think about that too. It's not just who's in the room, but it's also who's speaking. And I think, the second key structural issue to my mind is that the issue of gender equality is really about social equality and social justice. And so that, meshes very closely with this bigger challenge about climate justice. And I think if there's one big message, and time is short, so maybe this is my main message for this session, indeed for this Gender Day at COP, is that because of the issues you saw in that film in Bihar, because of the precarity of livelihoods and the fact that most poor in the world are in fact women, and the links to natural resources of those poorest people are so direct, the climate emergency is also a gender emergency. I think this is an enormously important message to get across on this day, and perhaps take that forward into COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt next year. That this isn't just an emergency about climate, it's a development emergency, and it's embedded in gender inequality. So in many senses, it's also a gender emergency. So I think, to sum up, really, really taking this forward in a perhaps a more political, power-centric way, trying to measure, in a sense, not so much the head count issues out there, who's participating, but the power count. So who has powers to do what? And how can we redress those imbalances, not just gender imbalances, but issues of poverty and race and class are absolutely critical too. So, I feel this has really come through in the presentations from Cameroon, but also in the film we've just seen, and the points made by Liza and Deepa. And I think, let's take that message forward, that the climate emergency is also a gender emergency. Thank you. Back to you, Upandha.
Thank you, Ellen. I think what we get from you is that we're by stuck in a knot of inequality where gender intersects with a range of social disparities and adds more pressure towards how do we overcome these climate change risk and impacts. And lastly, Aditi, your recent accomplishment was applying your knowledge on climate resilience by being a lead author on the water chapter in the recent IPCC report, focusing on adaptability and vulnerability to climate change. So, given such a background for working, from your field research to applying your analysis within a more comprehensive report, do you believe that the current climate change policies have enhanced their understanding of the gender impacts of climate change by including and representing a more diverse perspective of the world? Over to you, Aditi.
Yeah, thanks, Upandha. That's a great question, especially in the context of ongoing COP, where we saw literally hundreds and thousands of indigenous people and young women and men marching for climate justice. Was it like yesterday or the day before? Coming to your question, I think we have known now for decades that climate change impacts will be felt disproportionately by those who have not caused global warming in the first place by emitting CO2. So we have just basically known it for decades. It's been very well known that the hotter, humid, tropical parts would face the more impacts. So in the meanwhile, those who have emitted, also enabled by global systems of capitalism, industrialization, and colonialism, have actually managed to lift their citizens out of poverty. I suppose every country would like to do that. And they have achieved unprecedented amount of wealth and standards of living unknown in the history of humankind. And in the process, obviously reduce vulnerability to climate change. All that is fine, but in the process, leaving people of the global south, of the people about whom we saw those videos, completely vulnerable. So one of the interesting things I see that, like when the recent IPCC report was published in August, the Secretary General said that this is a code red for humanity. And I remember some young activists from Global South actually reminded us that it has been a code red for humanity for Global South for decades. So Global South has been living climate change now for decades. Yet it took us literally so many years to see the obvious. Now in 2021, climate change has started to impact also the global north. I mean, we are now living in 1.1 degree world and the impacts are clear. And we just witnessed kind of floods we saw in Germany, rich country full of adaptive capacity, yet extreme rainfall caused like unimaginable damage there. Forest fires in Australia, Canada, etc. But even within the global north, we see that it's the elderly, the immobile, the indigenous people, women who have been disproportionately affected. So I think there is a very clear understanding about the unequal impacts of climate change. And I do feel that both science and social movements have caught up with these issues of climate justice that Alan was talking about. But unfortunately, obviously, we aren't quite there yet. Coming back to global assessments, both like IPCC, with which I'm very fortunate to be involved, but also IP-based, I think they've been very particular about including perspectives of indigenous people who can be part of the solution. IPCC, I can speak from my own knowledge, they have ensured that their own authorship teams are diverse in terms of gender, nationality, disciplines, age, etc. And the current cycle, for example, is being written by a much more diverse group of authors than it has ever been in the past. And different perspectives and bodies of knowledge are being welcomed, creating a much richer tapestry of knowledge, if I may say so. So you can expect that this AR cycle reports to be much richer in content, partly because we do have much more knowledge, but they also are including gender perspectives and perspectives of vulnerability. So for me, that's really the start of decolonizing knowledge, and which we absolutely need should we want to seriously tackle climate change. So back to you.
Thank
Upandha.
you. Thank you. That was a great way to actually bring it all together, shifting into decolonizing climate science, moving away from this top-down hierarchical climate politics, and instead trying to include and listen up from the bottom-up ground of realities, right, when thinking about climate action. So thank you, brilliant. Thank you so much to each one of you for contributing your valuable time and your breadth of knowledge to this session, and it's indeed been a joy to converse with you. With that said, I'm going to hand it to Deepa to provide us with the closing remarks, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Upandha. So I don't know if we got some feedback on Mentimeter on the question that we asked, but I just want to end by saying here that was a wicked question that we asked. Should we be harnessing gender equality to achieve greater climate resilience? And what do we mean by that? Should we be relying on women to sort of lead the way into addressing very complex, very difficult climate challenges? Or can we plan for climate resilience and a informed by a decolonial science, climate science approach and implement programs and projects in business as unusual ways so that they can also transform entrenched and persisting gender inequalities, which are also cross-cut by intersectional aspects of poverty, ethnicity, and etc. that we talked about today. So that was a sort of a little bit of a wicked question to all of you, but I think it holds the heart of what the CGIAR gender platform is also really working towards, that can we put gender equality and social inclusion at the heart of the interventions that we take forward in relation to climate. And as my colleague Upandha said right at the very beginning, can we move from a more rhetorical adding in of women to a much more political engagement and recognizing the agency and voice and rights of marginalized groups, including indigenous communities that Aditi spoke about, women from the South, and which women from the South, we should also ask that. So those are the issues that would make a huge difference from gender in a business.